Welcome to episode 3 of the Norton Nemesis 1500cc V8 restoration. In this video we're going to be removing the cylinder heads to get a good look inside the engine for the first time. The sun was shining, so I decided to ride my ST1100 Honda up to the National Motorbike Museum in Birmingham to pick up some parts off the display engine that used to sit next to the Nemesis. And when I arrived, Bob, their peacock, greeted me in the car park. He's so friendly. This engine is partly machined and the case is loosely screwed together, but I wanted the airbox top and the alternator for the other engine. The alternator is from an early GSXR 750 Suzuki. It's held on with 3 screws, and the airbox top hasn't been cut for the battery, which is really good. The screws were just glued in place, the threads weren't tapped, so that made it easy to remove. They went round and round and round, it took me a while to realise, and then I just pulled them out, and here it is, the top, with no cutout for the battery, which is really good. I slide out the alternator and the first thing I notice is that the gear on the end has got helical teeth, but the gear it matches with on the engine at home has got straight cut teeth, so I'm going to need to change something to make that work. And here you can see where the casings aren't quite machined yet. Back in the garage, I need to prep the engine to remove the cylinder heads, so the first thing I did was made up an adapter for my DTI that screws into the spark plug thread. This uses an old spark plug, a bit of tube and a piece of rod in centre, and it slides down into the spark plug hole and screws in tight. Then I can find top dead centre position. I set piston number 1 on the front bank to top dead centre by putting the engine into top gear and using a socket on the drive sprocket to turn the crankshaft. There's no provision for turning the crankshaft on the actual crankshaft itself. After a few minutes of rocking backwards and forwards, I finally set the DTI to 0 and the pistons at top dead centre. So now I can use a black marker pen to first identify the camshaft sprocket, whether it's an inlet or an exhaust, front or rear, and also which tooth lines up with the face of the cylinder head. With that done, I can now remove my DTI from the engine and start loosening off all the screws that hold the camshafts into the engine. Each camshaft bearing cap is marked with a number that lines up with a number on the top of the cylinder head. It's really important that these are replaced in the same place because they're line bored as one when the engine's been made. Using a 4mm Allen key, I'll go along the camshaft bearings loosening the screws one at a time until the camshaft gently lifts up off the cylinder head just a little bit with the spring pressure. This is normal. This takes quite a while because there are 6 bearing caps and each bearing cap has 2 screws, and the screws have a long engagement in the threads in the aluminium cylinder head to prevent stripping. With all the screws loose, I start removing the caps one at a time from the camshafts and putting them in a tin on the bench. The camshaft is now ready to lift out of the engine. It just lifts off nicely off the bearing surfaces, and the first thing I notice is that the bearing surfaces are really shiny, so that's really good. So with the inlet cam removed, I can now proceed to the exhaust cam, first loosening off all the screws like before, then removing the caps. The caps are a nice sliding fit as you lift them. They're actually located with some shiny hollow dowels to make sure they're aligned correctly. With all the caps removed, I give them a visual inspection and they look absolutely amazing. They're barely worn at all, so I first clean them off with some brake cleaner to remove any residual oil and grease. Give them a wipe with a cloth. And as you can see, the surface is barely scuffed. A few little marks, but that would be expected. And the dowels are in really nice condition, and each one's stamped up with a number that corresponds with the number on the cylinder head. So that's really good. So they're really good. I'm really pleased with those generally. And the screws themselves, these are British screws, UNC, very long engagement and very coarse thread, which is actually a good design. I next clean the camshafts and have a quick look at the bearings, and they're also in very good condition. A few minor marks, which you'd expect from the bit of running it's actually had, but generally in really good condition. I feel the camshaft lobes with my thumb and finger, feeling for sharp edges, but they feel really smooth and shiny, so that's really good. With the camshafts removed, the next thing I need to do is loosen the cylinder head bolts. These are actually cap head screws that screw through the cylinder head into the block. There's 2 small ones on the outside and several large ones in the middle. Using a 4mm Allen key, I first loosen the 2 screws on the right hand side of the engine. These are quite tricky to get to, they're very close to the casting. I now start to loosen the main head bolts. These are very tight. I proceed in a sequence evenly from one side to the other side, gradually loosening the cylinder head bolts until they come loose. And here's the first one removed. These are high tensile M10 metric cap head bolts. The bolts have a very long thread engagement into the cylinder block. With the last head bolt removed, the cylinder head is now finally ready to come off for the first time, so I use a screwdriver to very gently lever the cylinder head off the block. There are levering points each side, as to not damage any surfaces, and it just breaks the seal and then lifts off. And here it is. Underneath it reveals some relatively shiny pistons with barely just a bit of oil on the surface, no built up carbon at all, which is really amazing. I have a quick look under the cylinder head and the valves are clean, just a slimy sort of film of oil on the surface which wipes straight off with a cloth. This engine has seen very little use. I move the cylinder head out of the way for now. We'll have a better look at that later, because now I want to get the rear cylinder head off. So as before, the first thing I need to do is set the piston to top dead centre on the right hand cylinder. So I use my DTI gauge screwed into the spark plug hole and repeat the process. The piston needs to be set at top dead centre on the compression stroke so that both exhaust and inlet valves are shut on the outside cylinder. As the piston is approaching top dead centre, I gently tap the ratchet handle by hand whilst watching the needle to get the highest reading. It's quite tricky to get the position of the engine correct, and it's really important that it is, so I can get the camshafts in exactly the right place when I put the engine back together. So it's worth spending the time to get this right. Eventually I get there, so now I can mark the camshafts as I did in the front. I'll put some black marker pen on the teeth that correspond with the surface of the cylinder head, one at the back, one at the front. Mark it rear camshaft exhaust and rear camshaft inlet. And then I can remove the DTI gauge from the cylinder head itself, ready to start removing the cam caps. Some of these screws are really tight and others weren't quite as tight, which is a bit strange. But they all come undone eventually. Sometimes the hollow location dowels remain in the cylinder head. I'll remove these later for safekeeping. I've just noticed that Charlie Weaver's not around today. He must have gone off to get some more whiskey. With the rear inlet camshaft caps removed, I can now lift out the camshaft. And initial indications are it looks in really good condition as well. Here's the marks I put on the teeth to line up with the surface of the cylinder head. With both the rear camshafts removed, I can now start loosening off the cylinder head bolts, one at a time in an even pattern, until they're all loose. This time I use an Allen key to spin the bolts out of the cylinder head. It's much easier. With all the head bolts removed, I noticed there's some hardened steel washers on the actual base of the cylinder head that have stayed stuck, so I used my magnet to get those out. They're held in place with the oil surface tension. These are nicely made machined washers. So now I'm ready to lift off the rear cylinder head. And the same as the front, the pistons are actually in quite clean condition, although some of these are slightly more black than the front ones were, indicating maybe it'd been running on the back bank more than the front. The first thing I noticed is that some of the water holes from the block up to the cylinder head are blocked with some residual sort of rusty slimy mess, which I have to hook out. Here you can see it coming up. This wouldn't be ideal and could have contributed to the reason why it overheated slightly when Henry was riding it on the Motorbike Show last year. I just checked the mesh of the cam gears and they feel really nice with a couple of thousandths of an inch clearance, which is really good. The rear bank generally seems more messy than the front bank was, indicating it's probably been running a lot more in its time. And as I look closer, I see more blocked holes. This engine doesn't have a conventional cylinder head gasket. It has individual O-rings around each water jacket hole and each oil hole, and a copper ring around the cylinder to make the seal. You can see the copper rings here pressed into the cylinder block. And here's the recesses for the O-rings around the water jackets. The bores have some few light scores in them, which I'm hoping will hone out. And And here we go, as I remove more rubber O-rings, even more crud. This will need to be completely washed out in the garden, I think, to make sure I get all this out of the engine. It's quite therapeutic picking it all out. I spend a few minutes cleaning up the top of the engine and actually surprised how well it came up. The pistons look almost brand new. The bores are reasonably good. There's one or two scored ones which I think I can recover with a very light hone. It's quite mesmerising watching the pistons rise and fall in a V8 engine. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and in the next video I'll be stripping out the gearbox and clutch. Our Paulie Hedgehog from a few videos back has returned from Oxford Wildlife Centre. He's really happy to be home and is running around looking for food.